So I'm going to be a bit more subdued today because I'm in an office. So
yeah, okay. Awesome. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, welcome back to the Data Ethics Podcast, and we have our buddies Kevin and Wes here, and we're going to be talking about more interesting topics. So, Wes, you had a laundry list of things from the last time that you wanted to cover. So you want to just feel free to kick it off.
Yeah, I have to pull them up. Well,
you want to share it? I mean, we can share it. Give me a sec.
It's on Twitter. Hold on. So now I'm making everyone wait. Hold on. Very unprepared. No problem. Uncharacteristically me.
You know why? It's the Haldron Super Collider. They fired it back up, and now everything's screwed up.
You know, I can't find it, so I can't find exactly the things I saved them on Twitter, so it's a really bad way of saving things.
Was it on our chat? I'm trying to look for it on our chat.
It wasn't. It was something where I tagged you guys and said, "Hey, we should talk about this."
Oh, it was a tweet. Okay. Well, anyway, what's on top of your mind, and maybe later we can find it.
Say again.
Well, let's just start with anything that's on the top of your mind, and then we can kick it off.
No, I wanted to talk about to avoid getting too conspiratorial, but I'm already going to go there. So when we talk about data ethics, I do think a lot about scientific ethics, not necessarily data science ethics. I think I mentioned that last time. You can still hear me, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things about I recently saw a podcast, like a portion of a podcast between some virologists about how they we don't believe that pangolins were the proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2 anymore. Which is funny because 2 years ago they were all about the pangolins. And if you listen to what they were saying, they're saying, oh, that lasted about 2 seconds or a couple of seconds. Whereas in actuality, they were pushing that for nearly a year or more. And so there's this collective gaslighting that they're doing on people. And it actually stems from an interesting bout of poor data. I'm being really polite here, but poor data curation and inspection. If you go back and just search on Twitter, Alina Chan, I think this is better if I just tell people how to find these things rather than tell people verbatim, because one, memory's not perfect, and two, my memory is not perfect. So if you search Twitter, Alina Chan pangolins, you realize that she had some really, really good threads from back in late 2020 about how weird the reporting was in certain clusters of papers with certain clusters of co-authors about data sets regarding pangolins and their viruses and similarity. How samples were collected was kind of suspect. And one of these papers actually was supposed to have been, the editor was Stanley Perlman from my alma mater, University of Iowa, who is a pretty prominent virologist who is also very outspoken about saying, there's a lab origin for the virus is nearly impossible. He was interviewed by, I think, the Daily Iowan or maybe the Des Moines Register or something like that. You can just look up Stanley Perlman from 2020 in news outlets, and you'll probably find what he said about that. And it's remarkable because he himself was supposed to be an editor on this PLOS pathogens paper about pangolin origin as a proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2. Alina mentions in her Twitter threads that, and you can inspect this yourselves. Like I said, I like to tell you to find the knowledge, and you can find it yourself and read the details, the nuance. Stanley was supposed to have been checking these data sets for any weirdness, if there's anything wrong with them. He never did, right? So he abdicated his duty as an editor for this paper, and it still made it in. These sort of weird issues ultimately exonerated the deer pangolin as the proximal source of SARS-CoV-2, but many people are still talking about pangolins for more than a year as the origin. And it's really remarkable because it's impossible, because the nucleotide sequences that underlie the amino acid sequences were starkly different. Although the spike domain for SARS-CoV-2 amino acid sequences were had high identity, very similar. The underlying codes are actually very different. So anyone who is just a student of genetics would be able to say, pretty good confidence that that's convergent evolution at best. There's a lot of weirdness about that, and that's just one example of data ethics, where someone who had control over the review process, the peer review process, the editing of a paper, and chose to not inspect further issues regarding sample collection, storage, maintenance, whether even the data were there, right? So these pangolin papers that Alina Chan mentioned, you can see all the sort of details in our Twitter thread, or the problems with the curation, maintenance of those data, and they were actually real data or not, or things like that. And the more I think about the issues with data ethics in regards to the last 2 years, I think that there's been a problem that's been ongoing for the last maybe 20 or 30 years that is just reared its ugly head now that we have the right amount of bureaucracy and the right amount of, I don't want to say oversight, because it's a lack of oversight, right? Like we had a replication crisis in science. Like at Amgen, I would talk with scientists and they'd say, this is a publicly owned, publicly traded company with 20-some thousand employees, state-of-the-art facilities. They would tell me, hey, we can't replicate this result in this Nature paper or this Science paper. Like, that's a problem. You have some of the best scientists, the best equipment, right? And you can't replicate something from a university lab. So what's lacking? Is it the money, the equipment, the personnel? Or is it maybe there's something wrong with the result that was reported, right? And so you can go back and look at Retraction Watch, and I learned about this during grad school. Many Nature and Science papers just get retracted, and I'm sure even many more other types of papers now, given the current standard of reporting in a post-SARS-CoV-2 world. So I feel like, first of all, we have this replication crisis, retraction issues, and then now this overextension of bureaucracy that's been ongoing, and now you have this perfect storm of people just neglecting their duty. I should be really diplomatic here because I'm being recorded. Neglecting duties for various reasons.
Since I'm not in the community, could I just point out the big 900-pound gorilla elephant standing behind you? A lot of it's political. A lot of it's political, with the ends and means. So it's more deconstructionist than following the data to get what you want. Look at the Fauci emails where they work together to not only silence scientific debate, but to attack the careers and working with big tech to silence anybody. I mean, these are Nobel Prize winners that they silenced. So I guess that's one example. A lot of it might be politically motivated.
Yeah, I think even on a more fundamental level.
Yeah.
I remember we started with the discussion on data drift in the last chat. So there's phenomena that naturally evolves. That's on the one hand, and then you've got, or maybe on the first instance, you have maybe a poorly designed experiment anyway. So that's one problem, and then you have data drift. And then what Kevin is alluding to is, I don't know, for lack of a better term, maybe political drift. on the one hand, at the time a study was done, it seemed comfortable for people to hear a certain result, and then later the appetite for such a study changes. And then I think the issue also is maybe intentions for the study, or intentions for the experiment changes. I mean, remember in the early stages of the pandemic, there was a series of papers looking at HIV, for example, and actually that even got, I think that even got published, linking HIV and the and the SARS-CoV-2 genome, and then they find out later that
one of them did get published, and then it got retracted.
Yeah, they retracted it. Yeah, and I remember the issue was, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, they were looking at a string of in the genome, a string of codes that actually appears in most genomes anyway, like 98%. It's like a random string, and on the one hand, linking it to HIV had political purposes. So Kevin can attest to that. But on the other hand, it's just probably just poor diligence on the part of the researchers. But then the other issue that the fourth issue that I mentioned was, at that time there was this mad rush to get anything related to COVID published, and that might have been the pressure. So I mean, these are like three different pressures acting on the experiment.
So the GP120 thing is a unique. I hesitate to call it a domain. I just recommend that people look into the portion that has that motif, I guess I could say. And that is not, I should say, a spurious coincidence or a small piece that is shared amongst all sorts of viruses. And I am familiar with what you were saying before about that, like many people in a rush to publish any sort of similarity to other viruses, they did do these sort of spurious, sort of very small segments that of course would be ubiquitous in various viruses. I'm sure that sort of thing would get caught as being kind of bogus, but the GP120 stuff was actually retracted because of, I guess it's an uncanny similarities between known HIV segments and SARS-CoV-2, and that's it kind of put a hole in a certain narrative that didn't want holes to exist.
I mean, I think it got confounded with, I don't know if it's at this point anecdotal evidence early on that some anti-HIV drugs were actually apparently effective at improving symptoms. I don't know what the latest is on that though, or it could be a different area of a different mechanism at work. But yeah, that just adds to all this kind of pressure that creates these issues. I'm actually quite surprised because I know in social sciences the replication crisis has hounded them for decades, but apparently it goes beyond social sciences, looking at biology, health.
Well, I posted something. I posted something interesting the other day, basically about the science being settled on a topic, and I chuckle when I hear that, because you can just pull up any sort of thread. Sorry, my connection is unstable. You can pull up any sort of thread on ResearchGate, and one of my favorite examples is slice physiology, because that's when you take a brain out of an animal and you put it in a solution milieu of salts to make the cerebrospinal fluid, and you try to keep that alive for as long as possible and as healthy as possible. There's a lot of voodoo in that. There's like a lot of voodoo. It's more art than it is science, and you go all the way from single capillary pipette, like a glass pipette recording. You push the electrode right up to the side of the cell using a microscope and a very stable micromanipulator. Even pulling a pipette requires a certain amount of technique and it's very a certain piece of equipment. How you manually suck and then release pressure on the glass pipette to get a seal on the cell. How you build your rig to reduce all the noise possible in your room with your electrical system, all this stuff, right? There's a lot that goes into it. It's like writing a song or like painting a picture, where you have to tailor it to your needs and how you feel is most appropriate for your experimental setup. And if you read the thread in the link that I posted, you had some rock star scientists discussing, what one might think is very, very lame aspect of experimental design, which is the salt solutions that you're using to record and keep cells healthy. And it's usually just like a small footnote in the method section. Yeah, we used this concentration of this salt for our ACSF, artificial cerebrospinal fluid, to keep the cells alive. It's like 2 lines in the method section. And there's a year-long discussion from a scientist at the Allen Institute, who's also, by the way, I can't sing his praises enough, Jonathan Ting, who's helped me and answered my questions many times, and was a wealth of resources for all of us in the slice physiology community. You have Jonathan Ting, you have professors from around the world discussing for a year on how to make good salt solutions.
How to formulate the salt solution in the first place.
And it's really, or like how to, what physiological, what temperature to record or cut, or which one salt to replace to get a certain solution. And he explains it Jonathan Ting explains it quite eloquently. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. This isn't settled. Even for something as simple as salt solutions, you need to try multiple of them to see what works best for you. Sucrose might work well, or N-methyl-D-glucamine might work well for when you're cutting a grain in a vibratone. Okay, and there's a lot of lingo there, but I'm just pointing out that there's a lot to work with, right? And this is from a year-long discussion and well into 20 or 30 years of slice physiology experiments. Like, the fact that these things are happening online, it should indicate that science, if done properly, is and again, to tie back to data collection is done properly, because that's a huge pillar of science, right? Is data collection and being open and transparent about it. It's a living thing, to use some metaphor there. It's a living thing, that it's an act of dialogue, right? Dialogos, right? And when someone says the science is settled, I'm like, I tune out, because this is that's not how it works. It's never how it works. And if you see me in the lab, by itself, I usually talk about this sort of thing. Yeah. Sorry?
Yeah, in the public domain, and this is also on many other topics, not even purely scientific topics, there's a very strong bias towards the word consensus. The moment the public hears the word, oh yeah, there's the consensus, everyone agrees on this, and they realize that actually doesn't sound like a scientific method. When you say people agree on it, it's like more of a very political method. It's a very dogmatic thing. Like, okay,
sounds like mob rule.
Have you ever, yeah, mob rule. Have you ever been to a scientific conference? I mean, I disagree with people all the time at those things. Or you'll have people asking really pointed questions in talks and things like that. It's very rarely a disagreement. And if someone has one answer that they're pushing, oftentimes it's because they've either got an agenda, or it's possible, and it's frequently also the case, they've read a hell of a lot about this thing, and the speaker they're asking doesn't know, and they might just say, I don't know, I'll look into it, right? It's very much not a consensus thing. What is a consensus? I guess you could say is that we have good evidence or replicable evidence for a phenomena in a certain context. And that's pretty much it, right? I really like to think about things like Bayesian ways of Bayesian. I've mentioned this before, like Bayesian all the way down. Like, you have to think about things in terms of Bayesians to really understand the causality and a good hypothesis for a cogent worldview. You can construct various examples of things where you could say a seemingly true sounding thing, but it's actually false, given the a realistic circumstance or context. Like, if you take a cocaine, you'll become addicted to it. Okay? No, not always, right? If you get shot in the head, you will die. I can construct all manner of situations in which
it's usually travel under the scalp, right? Around the brain. I know that much.
Let's talk about the bullet, the caliber of the bullet, the distance between the shooter and the victim. Like, there's the location, all sorts of things where you can construct something you construct a worldview where bullets enter a cranium, right? So you might have a bias in how you think about this thing, but when you actually think of all the variables at play, you might think, well, actually, there's some nuance to it. It's a very poignant example, but it just goes to show you that even in something where you think it's cut and dry, It's actually not necessarily the case, right?
Shouldn't there be more of a transparency in funding? I mean, let's be blunt. When you're looking for grants, they usually want a predetermined outcome, right? And it's just as easy to buy science
absolutely
as a
true.
politician. And so, wouldn't it be nice,
yes,
like you know how you have labels on the side of water, doctors drinking sparkling water. You know, it's got labels, right? Where it's manufactured, where it's bottled, right? Wouldn't it be nice if there was a sheet that was attached to a lot of the papers? This work was funded by these individuals and these organizations.
Well, you're required
papers have a disclosure.
Yeah, you need to disclose, but do people follow is the question. Yeah.
So like I have to disclose when I write a paper, like if I have any competing financial interests, right? Usually people don't say that they have nothing to disclose. It could be lying. That's possible.
When it's quoted, yeah, that's true. But when it's quoted, it's not like, hey, this was funded by the tobacco industry. You know what I mean? So it's like they'll use research and they'll use snippets of research done by Johns Hopkins, but nobody ever says, you know, this university was funded, for example, by the tobacco industry. You know what I mean? You have to go digging for it.
So yeah, that's the key thing. That's the key. Yeah. So the researchers themselves will indicate, right? So the researchers themselves will not indicate. Will say that they indicate no financial interest, but then if you dig back, you'll see the government, or sorry, the university and then received a grant from this company, or they paid for this person's tangentially related position, perhaps the dean or something like that, who pulled some strings, and now the academics, the lab is pretty well off, right? So it's maybe tertiary or something like that, but it's related, right?
Yeah. And so how would we fix that? How would we fix that? How would we fix all the?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I wish. So one of my ideas is go ahead.
No, I was gonna say there's the bias is already inherent, even in academia, because you have to register your hypotheses, and your department has the initial call whether that's even worth a study worth pursuing or not. And it's very opaque by which departments make that decision. Maybe it just half of it is operational. Okay, we don't have time for all of these frivolous topics. We'll choose the best ones that can continue our existence as a department. So there's already there kind of a moral hazard there. Like, okay, if our funders don't want these kinds of topics, then we will prioritize grad school grad students who will give us other topics that are more funder friendly. And even if you actually get to do the study, the peer review process is another biased lens, and I'd say maybe at best 50% peer review is
bullshit.
Yeah, exactly. At best 50% is objective, and they're just critiquing your language on the way you presented your paper. But the other 50%, you've been through that process. I've been through that process. It's either the mood of the reviewer, or the reviewer has I dare say ideology.
To borrow a term, to borrow a term from the left on this, it's gatekeeping. It is gatekeeping, because basically, if someone doesn't like your hypothesis, they could just kill your whole thing and just say, you know what, either redo your experiment, kill another 20 animals or more, and repeat your analysis, wait another year or two or something like that. Or they could just say, this isn't novel, or someone 20 years ago did something similar, or if they have an agenda against you, they don't like.
Doesn't support the message, right? It doesn't support the message.
And
or it's too experimental, perhaps. It doesn't fit in a certain.
It's too bleeding edge. I've heard that before. It's too bleeding edge, and it's funny because I've been a reviewer myself. I've also been a reader myself. You got to have this basic humility that you're judging state of the art, cutting edge, new stuff based on your experience, which is by definition outdated. You have department heads who haven't published a paper in decades, making a decision on young grad students. I mean, how can you possibly claim to gatekeep, or be in a position to gatekeep anything? You should be welcoming new ideas. And then, okay, so this is that's academic world.
That's very odd.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the corporate world, there's a different kind of gatekeeping, though. This is where kind of the commercial data science comes in. And commercial data science kind of works a slightly differently. It's more inductive. You just go through some data, find some patterns, and then pursue that thread. But then you're at the mercy of, sometimes we have this term called HIPPO, the highest paid person's opinion. And if that, and again, similar to academic departments, probably the oldest executive in the room, and they've been doing whatever that company's been doing for the years, long before data became important, and they're going to judge you by you say, okay, all this data stuff, we've been doing that, shooting from the hip with our instincts.
They have domain knowledge.
The domain knowledge.
Well, this is where strategic selling comes in and conceptual selling, right? You actually have to make the value leap. This is why selling an idea, research, business projects, this is why it isn't both an art and a science. You have to know who the decision makers are, what triggers them, what are the things that they're looking for. You can come in with the most justified thing, but if in their mind thinking, I have a baby on the way, this is going to be more work, I'm not really interested, or they don't have, because people buy for their reasons, not yours. And a lot of times, especially in academia, I'm the guy, or not academia, forgive me, but in technology, I'm the guy that's in between the raw science and the development, like, we're doing this, and the one that makes the value leap to get the money for investment, because you have both of them in the room, and they'll talk, and then they'll turn to me and go, Kev, we don't understand, can you translate? And I'm like, okay, this is good. You're going to make a lot of money, stuff like that. So I think a lot of it comes down to conceptual selling and strategic selling. You have to make the value leap for the people at the other end, because they buy for their reasons, not yours.
Everyone has to be a psychologist.
One area in technology, and maybe after this, let's jump back to that original thread you had, Wes. But one area in the technology that I'm a little bit more optimistic on is when this open source trend started picking up, maybe in the last 10, 15 years, with the emergence of the internet and GitHub, etc. There's a natural in tech bias towards stuff that works. It's very practical. It's if I find a piece of code that someone wrote, whether I mean, tech people also blatantly rip off each other, and I think that's part of the reason why it endures, because you tend to rip off someone for something that works. I mean, the nicer people give credit where credit is due. But then the fact that there's that bias towards, I don't know what you want to call it, practical utility, I mean, it's very utilitarian, is, I think, slightly better than this prevailing issue we have in academia and the corporate data science, where you won't even get to the point where you get to prove it works. It actually, you're killed at the idea level because of politics, because of ideas, while the tech people, they kind of assume everything doesn't work at the start, and you look around for things that could work, and then you enhance it, and then later it becomes a monster like Google and Facebook. I don't know if there's a way we can bring that back into the sciences, because that used to be what the original
it's there.
method. Yeah.
Depending on the field that you're in neuroscience, there is still a pretty good amount of that stuff that works ethic. And I mentioned it on a Twitter thread the other day, actually. It takes a PhD to install Kilosort, which is,
I saw that.
You're a scientist, So if you look at Kilosort on GitHub, you'll see there's 3 versions, no, maybe 4 versions. You have to have the right graphics card, you have to have the right version of MATLAB, you have to have the right version of Visual Studio, you have to have the right version of Python, you have to have all these things actually have to align. And in a university or institute setting, you can't always get the right PC that you want to have. So actually getting all these moving parts to align, especially for a lot of academics who don't code, is actually not it's not trivial. And so it was kind of this tongue-in-cheek remark, but it's more harrowing than I thought it was to get something that works and is functional. Like, this is a piece of code that's used to analyze neurophysiological data, that's like spike trains, right? To extract the waveforms out and say, okay, this is a unit, and we don't really want want to say it's a neuron, but it's a unit, which is ostensibly a neuron, and it's separate from this one, right? That's what we call spike sorting. It's probably one of the best algorithms to do that. And for the last 30, 40 years, whatever, people would either write their own or use poor commercially available ones. And then you have to kind of modify to fit your own purpose if you could modify it. And in the last maybe 10 years or so, various algorithms that have emerged that, you know, of stuff that works, people copying each other and then discussing what could be done to streamline the process, because at some point, a human usually has to like manually sort the units and judge for quality and clustering, things like that at the end. So kilosort, I think there's another one called mountain sort, various other ones, spiking circus, yet another spike sorting algorithm, YAS. All these came out of the you know, sort of group agreed upon sort of idea. Like, you know, we don't want to have a person doing these things at the end where you could vastly change your results depending on how many units you get, right? One unit can change an entire experiment basically depending on how it fires, right? So the desire to eliminate the human error from that equation has brought out a grand, you know, alternatives and grand new algorithms that do this, but it's not trivial to install them. And even comparisons amongst them in a Twitter thread from a couple of years ago, I saw like maybe 2018, 2019 at a conference on spike sorting. One of the inventors or the creators of Kilosort was comparing their algorithm to mountain sort, and there was like, you know, I want to say like several thousand spikes difference in what they collected. And this is like from a ground truth data set where they could say, okay, you know, there was actually this many units, right? And so, first of all, again, depending on who does the experiment, how they collect the data, and what methods they use, you could get different results. So the science never settled. And at the bleeding edge, the differences exist, and it's not trivial to assess these differences or even replicate these results and get them running in other labs. And I know Kilosort is used in various institutes like the Allen Institute, various very, very famous labs. So I know it's possible to get to work. But when you say stuff that works, there's a lot that's unsaid about how to get it to work. That requires a certain amount of expertise. And I do like the idea of this stuff that works sort of ethos, because it's very similar to art. It's very similar to music. So we have people ripping off musicians all the time, going back to rock music, to you know, gospel, to classical music. It's like everyone's ripping each other off. That's like this iterative process of how like ideas evolve. It's the same as how like, you know, sets of genes will evolve in time. Sort of this fitness, right, in a certain context. It's very much a real thing.
Like frameworks and libraries, right? So you have libraries of code.
Yeah.
Right, and then you can have all the frameworks and libraries, but putting it all together and making it like, you know, there's a difference between, you know, just using a template and frameworks and then being able to make something, you know, ad hoc and work with everything together. So it is art and science. Definitely. That's where Python comes in.
Yeah, very much so.
You know, you're just looking at the, like, oh, I don't understand.
Yeah, and you know, I'm in the process. I'm always like, you know, always learning sort of mindset. So I'm always adding to my arsenal of code that I can use. And so yeah, Python, getting used to integrating MATLAB with Python and vice versa, using various toolkits is something that I'm actively trying to do right now as well. So very much a process. But yeah, this I will also comment. You mentioned something. It's also something that exists only in parts of academics. This stuff that works mentality. Like, where did it go in other aspects of academics? Like, why is it only existing in certain parts? Like, what happened to psychology that caused it to have sort of abandoned these ideas in favor of, I guess, politics, right? Like Matt Walsh interviews a psychologist on his, you know, thanks to Kevin, I could see this. He asked a psychologist at UCLA, you know, again, my other alma mater, you know, what is a woman? And the psychologist feels threatened by that question. Like, how do you go from having a very basic heuristic for understanding the world that, you know, gender or sexual, I guess you could say your sex, right, what you have chromosomes for and you have reproductive organs for. How is that a controversial thing to a psychologist?
Because it's a religion. Postmodernism woke is a religion. It's a religion. It's a way to view the world that is outside of the Enlightenment, the age of reason, right? So we have, right, when truth is
when you capitulate. Well, truth can be context dependent, is what I've said before. But when you capitulate something in a particular context because it might be similar to another context, when you reason by analogy, when you shouldn't, you've lost ground that should never be lost. Like when you capitulate that, someone could just decide to be a woman because they feel like it. Then you could.
My son thinks he's a dinosaur. My
5-year-old. Right. There's a potential for a loss of reason. Okay, and it's silly to even have to discuss this. Honestly, it's silly to discuss this because it doesn't make any sense. And why should we discuss these non-truths? Yeah, it's crazy making. It's basically crazy making. You're entertaining these ideas that just don't make sense. So you have to like rationally discuss them.
In the middle, yeah, in the middle.
You can't rationally discuss.
This is the issue I have with it. You're having a rational discussion about things that you need to get accomplished, and it's here comes the woke ideology that just throws the entire conversation off the train, off the tracks, and then you have to go back. So this ideology is not conducive to like getting things done, because there's always intersection points to where you said the wrong word, or used the wrong pronoun, or and it's like, my God, can we just get back to the point of we're trying to get something done here, And so that's what I found interesting since I'm a technologist about how companies like especially Basecamp and others have had to deal with this inside their Slack and inside their development. It's like, listen, can you just focus on work? Because we could split hairs 7 ways to Sunday. I could claim that I'm a 65-year-old Filipina. You have to address me by my pronouns Lola. You know what I mean? And then tomorrow I could be fluid. I could be a furry. Who knows? So it's like,
hey, I identify as shaven. I identify as shaven.
So I think it's narcissism. It's like a religion of narcissism, and it distracts from real world things getting done. And I see it weaponized in many areas against the population, get us so busy focused on stuff that doesn't matter. We're not actually producing good ethical work. That's my 2 cents.
Okay. Speaking of another thing about woke stuff, like, this is a sort of a reach, but you all saw that Hunter Biden's iPhone leak stuff, right? So he was actively weighing out what appeared to be, at least to my eyes, 26.6 grams of crack rocks, right, on his little portable scale. First of all, is it ethical to have viewed that, I wonder, that bit of data? Is it ethical that it was released? Don't we have a right to know these things about our leaders and their family members who have sort of compromising positions in the world? Like this is another issue where
he's the president of the United States of America, and he's putting people in prison for life, right? So, I mean, come on. It's like one of the things that I found very distasteful here was when, I don't want to say the country, I don't want to get into that part because we're mad, but if your policy is to punish poor people for something and you're caught doing it, then, that's rules for thee and not for me. And it doesn't matter how the information wants to be free. I'm old school Clue Train Manifesto, information wants to be free. Open data, as long as you can, as long as you don't, harm people with the data, and that's the ethical use of it, right? If you're a public figure doing these things, then by all means, yeah. I look at that as like investigative journalism, like Project Veritas or whistleblowers, right? Hackers like Assange and the rest of those. That is the new medium, and people are trying so hard to come down against it. I mean, look at Snowden. I mean, the guy gave up his life for what he believed, and that was, guys, you got to pay attention to PRISM, right? And it's even worse now. So that's my thought.
Yeah, I was gonna jump in on the thread that Kevin mentioned on. I mean, postmodernism isn't monolithic. There's so many parts to it, and if you dissect it, I think one of the most I think what Kevin is alluding to is actually a mix of two different things. One is uh, one of the French thinkers, Baudrillard, if I'm pronouncing it well. He was the one who coined this concept of simulacra and simulations. It was actually the basis for the movie Matrix, actually, and but he wasn't a big fan of that film because in the movie Matrix, you still knew whether you were in the Matrix or out of the Matrix. So if you're plugged in, you're like a superhero, and if you're out, you know the real world. What Baudrillard was saying is the point he was trying to make was in today's media infused and data infused society, you don't know anymore if you're interacting with a copy of a copy of a copy, and in a way that has implications from a research perspective. You tend to jump off from a previous study's ideas and try to add your own, and then at some point in that process, several generations later, you don't know whether the outcomes of the current state of the art has already kind of diverged from kind of originally proven facts or whatever that is. That's one part. The other part is, I think the more nefarious part is the framing of evidence, because the whole point of modernism is postmodernism is you can't trust what you see. That's the big problem. There's this inherent rejection of evidence, there's this inherent rejection of what the senses give you, and that's what the whole enlightenment was all about. Let's be empirical, let's judge things by what we can prove. So
Like
postmodernism,
it's important to do that. It is very important.
yeah, so there's that pushback, but I think it gets poisonous when the neo-Marxist narrative comes in, and that's the problem. It's such a heavy word when you mention Marx, but maybe we can soften it to when you frame everything as an oppression. The oppression narratives come into the picture, and then you were mentioning earlier about the psychologist being uncomfortable with identifying gender, for example. That's a classic case of when you mix postmodern, where what is gender? Is it just the genitals? So you're going to reject that view, and then you add the oppression narrative of, okay, we're going to be going straight versus gay now, or we're going to go LGBT or every letter in LGBT versus each other letter in the LGBT. So that's when it becomes poisonous. I want to add a third leg to that stool, which is my favorite classic problem in anything, is when you incentivize things. So the moral hazard of it. So now suddenly there's already a rejection of objective truth. There's an oppression narrative of some sort, because it's very seductive to think of everything as an oppression. And then you add money into the mix. Now people are going to bias towards, okay, I'm going to go with whatever puts food on the table or whatever gets me my BMW faster. Oh, that's really a mess now. And I don't know how to pull out of that, just dissecting that three-legged stool really hard at this point. You don't know where you're going to go. And that's why, if I track back to an earlier point, if you go back to pure innovation, both in the sciences and technology, the best work usually comes at the initial stages, where no one cares if they're going to get paid or not. They just want to create something that actually
Right.
works, the utilitarian part of it. Or some scientist says, the world needs this, I'm just going to let it go. I think the vaccine development followed a similar path in the early stages, when it wasn't even incentivized. The RNA innovation on that vaccine. I think the original author wasn't even compensated for it.
Malone's initial work in the 80s.
Yeah. I mean, it went unnoticed for decades because
Yeah,
it
went off the rails.
wasn't really looking at money, or maybe I'm putting it too simplistically, but it wasn't a billion-dollar industry that it is today.
It was largely, the technology could have been used for transgenic animals, which is
for something else,
research, right?
Exactly.
Or like, hey, I can plug myself. I wrote a good portion of my thesis not getting paid, right? I wrote my entire criticality algorithm on a leave of absence, okay? So I did it because A, I wanted to graduate so that there's some incentive there, but B, I was just doing it because I went a little bit nuts writing it, and I thought, this got to be done. I think this is an important contribution to science. I think you were about to say this, but I'll say it for you. Most important contributions from science come from the fridge. two science comes from the fringe of that science. And I'm a genetic guy, molecular biologist, sort of from undergrad. I worked in a genetics lab for 2 years, and I did electrophysiology for most of that time. But then I branched out to various other techniques, and I'm sort of, someone might say I'm an epistemological trespasser, because I've done various things in various fields that I'm not an expert in, and now I do something that's akin to physics, information physics, right? And I'm not an expert in it, but I think that the principles in it are important for neuroscience. So if it's relevant to my interest, and if it's relevant to the point I'm trying to make, I'm going to try to learn it. And because of that, I am on the fringe. To tie it back there, it's not.
You're not mainstream. You're not mainstream academia, where everyone seems to converge on kind of a center of gravity and safely stays there in that orbit. But if you look back in
trying
the past,
to discuss neural criticality to people, it's very difficult.
Yeah, it's hard, and it's interesting because even that term of trespassing, we heard that term from a public health, no, not even a public health, an infectious disease, an ID practitioner, and that's a notorious group now because they kind of reject everyone else's opinion about, COVID, for example. But then a lot of the advances in science were the result of trespassing. Physicists getting into biology, biologists getting into psychology. I mean, that's how you create
engineers entering.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know how it got to that point. Well, I think we kind of can track it back. It's precisely those three factors: the moral hazard, postmodernism, and the narratives. But then the ethics question is, how do you extricate ourselves from it? What is an alternative that isn't too much of a struggle? I think that's the problem. We're kind of sucked into this. We're now in the event horizon of this black hole, and it's really, really hard to get out.
I think that you described it perfectly. I feel humbly, and this is just my opinion, I feel like it's a black hole, that if we don't stop the movement towards this oppression Olympics and concept of power and hierarchy, we're never gonna, it's like we're gonna go through the dark ages again, right? And I see that we're running headlong into the dark ages. And I think the best way to combat that is to let people know what you're speaking is not a reality, it's an ideology like Christianity, right? Because people don't grasp, they don't know what they know, and they don't know why they know it or how they know it. And they just latch on to the ideas that are being fed to them. People don't do the hard, like Dom, I told you this back in 2016 when Trump got elected. I was like, why is everything like this? And I started researching what had happened from the liberal, because I consider myself a classic liberal, right? How come I'm no longer liberal, and how come I'm now super right wing? Because I didn't change. The Overton window changed, and what had happened was, and you nailed it, postmodernism with the.
You're not super right wing.
Now I'm like freaking far right, and I'm like, wait a second, 15 years ago I was considered a liberal. You know what I mean? So I think people don't understand what they believe and why they believe it, and that there's another way to see the world that isn't. And this is where that whole neo-Marxism crap and postmodernism comes in, is they use language as a weapon, as like a dialectic you enter. And once you enter dialectic,
they weaponize guilt as well. Like they understand that regular people feel guilt about things. And so I finished watching that Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson episode. That's 4 hours where Jordan Peterson is wearing a tuxedo for some reason. They weaponize guilt. He mentions that. And you have to first refuse to have your guilt weaponized against you, because these people are wolves, and they'll use whatever they can against you. So you have to first understand that we're in it, and then the following guest that Joe had on, Majid Nawaz, what is his name? The former the British citizen who was arrested in Egypt and stuff, who was a member of that coup d'etat organization, right? I didn't finish that episode, but he mentioned that, as Alex Jones would say, we're in an information war, right? It's a new war ongoing, right? And as conspiracist as that sounds, to repeat my point, I really don't like saying these things, It's not like, it's not something that's pleasant to say, but there is a new front in which your position, your heuristic for understanding the world is under constant, assault all the time, from academic papers, media, politicians, everywhere you go. Unless you have an insulated worldview or a well crafted, cogent worldview, you're going to be persuaded to think in a certain way, either through these struggle sessions or like passively accumulating other people's thoughts onto your own, right? And you have to resist that to be at least an independent person.
To be a thought leader, to be able to have original thought and to create. That's where I see it going into the dark ages, is because have you seen the miniseries Chernobyl, right? Before all the war and stuff. Remember that?
Have not, no.
Oh, it's a brilliant discourse on how hierarchies of authority stop science and stop even questioning things that go wrong, right? And so people were too afraid to even say, hey, this is wrong, this technology is not working right. And then it blew up eventually into a meltdown, and nobody was allowed to even criticize the numbers or the data they had because of the attachment to...
The same thing that happened with me and it's the same thing that's happened to me in the vaccine stuff, or the genetic transfection stuff. It's like, I'm not allowed to question, not even allowed to discuss papers. You get banned from LinkedIn, you get banned from Twitter, you get banned from various things, because the hierarchies that are in place have a vested interest in controlling the outcome, and they ban people, anonymous accounts, they ban non-anonymous accounts like myself, when we just want to talk about data, right? And if you're in Chernobyl and you have a meltdown coming around, you better be able to discuss that. If you have 26% reduction in birth rate,
right? Exactly. It's way worse. It's way worse now. This is worse than Chernobyl, and we're not allowed to talk about it in open company. Like, aren't we supposed to have conversations in an open market of ideas?
We should.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say I want to come in from another angle. And I was asking this in the last meeting as well, Wes. What part of this issue, or what part of the solution, positively, is the information flow? Because I think a lot of the issues also stem from the fact that we have social media, we have the internet, so information just spreads so fast, so instantaneously. But kind of our thinking processes are still back in the pre-internet era, where we're unable to react. And this is both from a receiver of a communication and a sender of communication. People don't know just how badly they communicate until it starts going viral. That's one half. The other half is also kind of how we're wired.
I could be messing this podcast up. I could mess this podcast up. I could mess the previous episode up and not even know it. I haven't seen it. I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
no. I mean, that's one part. The other part is I keep trying to figure out how much of this is because of the way we're wired, like mentally. For example, a lot of what the challenges science goes through is also in the storytelling of the science, and that's what, in a way, reinforces some of these bad narratives or bad
archetypes, myth. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I don't know, is that because it's more compelling to hear or listen to, I don't know, for lack of a better word, weird arguments, and then how much of that is also influenced by the fact that it's because of this information flow. You say something stupid, goes viral, and now you spend most of your time reacting to stupid rather than actually discovering the inherent truths. Anyway, go ahead. Yeah. You're on mute.
Guilty. I'm saying I'm guilty of being stupid.
You're muted.
Yeah, I'm saying I'm guilty of being stupid and saying stupid things.
I do it all the time. I think, like I mentioned last time, though, Dom, like, we are hardwired to accept a certain flow of information from the real world, because you have five senses. You accept what you sense as real, and you accept cogent sounding or simple narratives or simple sounding things as true, because it tracks, right? So when people are paid millions of dollars to create a narrative that tracks, right? Like, oh yeah, Putin bad, Ukraine good, or whatever, right? Like, irrespective of my opinions on that, that's the narrative, right? It's simple. People can latch onto what's simple, and like I mentioned before, informationally complex things are just mathematically and then energetically are complex to process and to think about the context, right? You know, it's funny. I have behind me. This is purely coincidence, but I don't know if you can see this. But there's a board that says integrated information theory. Maybe you can't read that or not, but
Was that purely coincidental?
I noticed that when I came in here, that someone else is working on something related to Giulio Tononi, and that's in my dissertation in the paper that I'm working on. You know, it's an old dissertation now, but it never got published. But yeah, I incorporate some integrated information theory stuff into this paper that's coming out, and I want you guys to promote that for me when it happens. But it's difficult to parse things that are complex. It's easy to parse things that are simple, right? That's the definition of truth, really, in a way. Like, truth is if it tracks and it comports to reality. The problem is that more complex truths require more energy and more time to discuss, right? But it doesn't comport with reality. That's truth, right? Does it comport with a something as you experience with multiple synchronous inputs, right?
Have you read the book Blink? The book Blink. Have you read that?
No, I haven't. You know, I mostly read papers.
Yeah. So the author goes into how we make complex decisions in a fraction of a second, and he uses this. He uses in the beginning of the entire. I'll send you the book when we're done. But thin slicing is a term of how the human brain recognizes patterns instantly. And he uses the story about how they found this Greek statue or a Roman statue, Greek, Roman, whatever. And the marble was tested, the carbon dating was tested, everything was tested. And it was found in like some underneath this excavation, okay? And a priest walks in, looks at it and he goes, it's fake, turns around and walks out. And everybody's like, how? And they didn't believe the priest. The priest said it's fake. He just knew it was fake. He said, look at the hands, look at everything else. It took them like 7 years to determine that this thing was fake, and they'd already spent millions, right? And it turns out it was fake. And what they had done was they found the right marble, they found the right age, they did the whole stress testing, they found, you know, and so. But what it was the priest knew the period and the art and the masters so well that he could walk in and immediately know thin slicing that the hands were wrong, and it was the hands. The hands were wrong. It was from a different period. And people are like, no, that can't be. And that's how the book Blink starts. And it goes into how you can complex medical issues by having thin slicing. You know, old doctors are really good at spotting stuff because they have so much experience in seeing what it's a really good book. They call it thin slicing. And I think that's what you're trying to.
I'll take a look at that. Yeah, and I mean, or it's like when I read the proximal origins paper about COVID, again, I talk about COVID a lot these days, like all the things about it had the trappings of an official, you know, scientific paper. But if you actually know the literature and know the context of how a paper is done, it's actually a letter to the editor. It's only 3 pages long. There's only like 2 figures. There's no statistics, a lot of weasel words thrown in. But if you're an expert in these things, or at least you've been a grad student, you should be able to just realize that this is just bogus, right? And so knowing what a good tell is for a good narrative, it requires, you know, critical thinking and some domain knowledge, some domain knowledge, right? You don't necessarily have to be a religious scholar and spot the hands on the statue, but that's a good example.
That's a great analogy. Doc, what's an example of something that you've been able to thin slice and put together quickly?
Many things. Well, one of the more recent ones. You're involved in this one too, the dengue project that we did with NASA. Yeah. So anyway, 2019, we joined this competition, and we proposed. I wouldn't exactly say it novel, but maybe as a solution, it was novel at the time. A way of getting ahead of dengue epidemics by using satellite data and then looking at conditions that are ripe for mosquito habitats. That's one part of the solution. So you'll know where the mosquitoes are in theory. And then another part is just good old time series prediction. So you're overlaying rainfall, Google searches, and actual past surges in dengue to get ahead of likely future surges. So those two things together put that in an app, and yeah, and NASA liked the idea. Now here's the fun part. This is where all the moral hazards and all that stuff comes in. Well, number one, COVID stole our thunder, so we got that out in the fourth quarter of 2019, and then COVID just occupied the mind space for the rest of 2020. That was one thing. Second is this is going to be a rabbit hole. Second is the Department of Health and WHO were not interested because I would say the established surveillance, health surveillance, is you wait for people to get sick, and that's how sentinel surveillance works. That's how active surveillance works. And I'm thinking, where's the predictive?
I lost you entirely there. So sorry, my connection.
So no, I was saying they're not as interested in predictive surveillance. They'd rather wait for actual cases to emerge, and and that blew my mind. From a health policy standpoint, you say there's the reason why we use AI and these tools, so that you can efficiently allocate resources. And then the third part, this is the most interesting. So we continued working on the dengue project anyway for free, right? I mean, that's how science works. And then we noticed that during the lockdowns, the cases in dengue dropped dramatically, like near zero. And we're wondering, how is that possible? Of course, some theories are, oh, maybe because of the lack of mobility, people aren't getting exposed. That's one. And we're trying to find if there's legs to that idea. But then if you add the politics to it, there's a very, very high chance that dengue was happening, but it was just misdiagnosed as COVID, because the symptoms are very similar. And so that's the rabbit hole that we're trying to get into. And then now,
where did the flu go? Where did the flu go?
Exactly. And then now that
flu took a break for 2 years.
COVID's on the decline. Guess what? We got the new outbreak of dengue coming in, and I was thinking, okay. Well, on the positive side, we actually got UNICEF to start backing the project. And okay, so that's the thing. Moral hazards coming in again. Okay, dengue is in fashion. Money's going to flow into dengue because people are sick and tired of funding COVID. And it's just funny. So what do you do as a researcher? What do you do as an entrepreneur or a scientist in that environment? You tend to get thrown around, and you gravitate towards the fashion. And I'm really, really worried if that's how innovation in science is done these days, or for a long time. How do you get anything really, really sensible done anyway, despite that?
You move to a different country, and then you do the project that you wanted to do.
Yep, exactly.
That's why I came to the Philippines, Wes, and Dom. I was living in Australia at the time, and it was really expensive. And I was like, wow, I could save this money and get more developers for my project if I can live on $1,000 and then use the other $2,000 or $3,000 to hire more developers. And so that's one of the reasons why I came to the Philippines. I wanted to use the extra money I had to build projects. And then, because if you live in a high rent or a high cost of living area, you can't innovate if you're doing software and other things as well. So there's just
logistical stuff that you have to deal with that suddenly if you move somewhere else that has a different culture, different economics, things like that, it suddenly becomes easier to do the thing that you want to do. That's logistics. It's just a realistic concern of how that works. I'm lucky enough to speak some Korean, that I can come here and I can work on the project. I proposed it, and I'm working on it now. So America didn't want to do it. It's their loss, right?
Yeah, I mean exactly what you said. Some countries are more conducive to research. Some countries are more conducive to innovation, and as a researcher, that can make or break your career. That can make or break your track record. So on the micro level, on the macro level, because of that inherent, I would say, distribution or uneven distribution of innovation, it then retranslates it back to political, hegemony. Like once upon a time, maybe not even more than 10 years ago, China wasn't even a place where a lot of AI research was happening. Now I think they might have already surpassed what's happening in the States. And one reason for that is the US is also kind of buckling under this political problem, the polarization, which then impedes science. So I mean, on you could argue that this politicization is actually anti-science to begin with. And
so
yeah.
to go with that, I lived in Los Angeles, and I never got really into much of my tragic backstory. Like, I was happy to live in Los Angeles from 2010 to 2020, 2021, right? Sorry. Yeah, 2010 to 2021.
It's about a decade.
In LA. More, and that was, I think, the apex of the social media era of LA. Maybe not the apex of LA in general, right? Like, there's decades I wasn't there, but social media had established this sort of nice little thing. You could go to get-togethers and functions, and it was all well organized and stuff, and that definitely peaked before COVID. And now after that, it's on the decline. That's one aspect of it. There's no purpose in living in a big city like that anymore. With the absence of that social cohesiveness. The other issue is that those mostly peaceful protests burnt down things that I like to go to, right? Like, that's a realistic concern. Like, places in Melrose, places in Santa Monica, that were my haunts, that they were just looted, ransacked, and then just brushed under the rug. It was mostly peaceful protests, right? Like, definitely not riots that were violent, right? And that was the beginning of my, like, Kevin, you said you were classical liberal. I would think of myself as that as well. And I thought that California was like a place that if you were like someone who was sort of liberal persuasion, you feel comfortable living there. No longer, once I realized that there's this entirely subversive aspect to living in California, where violent criminals could be released on the streets with no bail. They would just oh, you have a court date, you just go out on the street again, and maybe they're released on the
because that's when I started studying. It's because I wanted to find out what happened to liberalism, and it's not liberalism anymore. It's postmodernism, progressive woke ideology. It's this,
and you realize that sooner than me. Like, when Trump became elected, I was like, that's kind of funny. Like, Trump, he said some funny things. He's a celebrity, so we've had a celebrity as a president, before. I thought, okay, maybe he'll be good at talking to people. And then he said some mean tweets, and I think I tweeted that before, like, oh, but Trump tweeted mean tweets, in reference to, like, Hunter Biden's issue coming into light. Like, what would you guys rather have, like a mean tweeting guy, or like a guy who has conflicted political and monetary ties to foreign governments in that regard? I digress. Trump was an eye-opening moment for me when I was at a talk at the physics department at UCLA, and a fellow student, I was a postdoc, and a student, a Korean grad student, was pointing out, like, these testimonies against the Trump appointee Kavanaugh were just lying through their teeth about these sexual allegations against him. And I was like, well, she's a professor. How could you doubt her? And then I realized, professors lie all the time. They lie all the time about funding. They lie about whether or not they'll support you. They'll lie about God knows. They can lie about data. They can lie about any this, that, and the other. Why wouldn't a professor lie about Trump's appointee nomination? This was in 2018, right? And so I started to look into these things. Like the good people on both sides and things like that. How everything Trump was saying was, like, being critiqued and, like, flipped around, and I kept that in my back pocket. Like, okay, we have someone who's being the intense subject of ridicule by all the major media outlets. I'm thinking, okay, I'll take it with a grain of salt. I know Trump has said things that are controversial. It's like, maybe he says a lot of things on the cuff. I wouldn't necessarily want that in the leader of the free world, but at the same time, he does shoot from the hip and tends to get a lot of things right. So I took a lot of things that he said, and the mainstream media who vehemently opposed everything he did, with a grain of salt. 2020 rolls around. Trump says something about something that was found in a peer-reviewed paper about hydroxychloroquine, and says that the virus comes from China, and he's shut down for saying very, very obviously truthful things. And I'm thinking, okay, something is not right. And then suddenly we have these mostly peaceful protests burning down my city, and the storm of everything occurs, in which I'm like, there's nothing that can be trusted. This is like,
right,
this
exactly.
is like,
that's when all of a sudden you realize there's these intersecting interests that, I mean, they were well funded, they were well organized, right? And then they're not allowed to be banned. That conversation's not banned, but anything against them is. So it was definitely, it's definitely, I feel we're in a civil war, like a Marxist civil war pushed by the progressive left. And it's hijacked.
And it is anti-science. It's anti-questioning. It's anti-science. It pushes scientists like myself, who are center or even left of center, away. I no longer live in America because of this. This is supremely odd, because I would love nothing more to work at an academic institution or industry job, right? Like I was working at Amgen before all of this, right? I'd like to go back to that, but the environment of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, these sort of things, coupled with these inability to question very basic observations, is just very anti-scientific. I can't stand that. That's just fundamentally opposed to what I, as a scientist, stand for, and it pushes people like me out. Suddenly, you're only going to have an echo chamber of libs in science. You
better check your privilege.
Yeah. I mean, I'd rather be a second-class citizen here than live in whatever shithole LA is at this point, and that's saying a lot. And I'm cursing, but really, go to LA, go to San Francisco, and tell me tell me you really think that's a metropolis?
I'm from Northern California,
quote, greatest country on earth.
Right, I grew up in Northern California. In Northern California, San Francisco right now is worse than any third world slum I've ever been into. I mean, even there, they will sweep the sidewalk. You know what I'm saying? Go to a slum. They will take care of it. You know, but in San Francisco, it's gone. And that progressive, that destruction, that victim mentality, and I believe on purpose, the election of DAs and prosecutors that won't punish crime. It's on purpose to destroy America. I humbly believe that. I really believe it is.
Well, it's also that, when you have a liberal bias in your political thinking, you tend to think like empathetically about things. Like you tend to think like, I feel their suffering. And that's a good thing to feel empathy. But we all feel empathy. Suddenly, when you base all politics on fringe cases, where like empathy you think is the principal component of like what would be the positive outcome there, you're missing the point. Like policy is supposed to be something that
you use data ethically to balance that. You have to balance those feelings with data, right? It's like when the governor of New York said, shame on the Supreme Court for giving us what the Second Amendment says. And someone says, so what you're saying is lawful abiding citizens can't protect themselves. And she outright said, I don't care about the data. I feel this way, And so we've got an entire ruling class that act like children, that don't base it on data. That's one of my hopes with what I'm doing with Ethics PH, is that we can promote sound policy decisions that help humanity based on data, right? That's transparent. Transparency is the best sunlight.
I love that. That's a great soundbite.
So I think, well, we're coming to again the hour again, and there's never enough time to talk about everything. Actually, we're more than an hour, so it's really good. What are some good next steps from your perspective, Wes? I mean, this isn't a definitive discussion by any means, right? But from a takeaway standpoint, we talked a lot about ethics, data ethics. There's a fair bit of politics involved. There's moral hazard involved. So as someone like you, like a scientist, a research practitioner, from the fringe, as you define it, and I would say that characterizes a lot of people nowadays who want to get into science. What's a good series of principles maybe we can impart, and then later we can explore further?
Sorry, a series you cut out there.
Series of principles and rules. I don't know, maybe guidelines that we can give people as far as this is concerned.
There's a book that I have. It's like Principles of Ethics in Science, something like that. And I recommend people read these sort of read these sort of things, and just try to keep your data as open as possible. Even if, like last time I mentioned, when someone requests your data, the impetus is on you to actually help them. And I said, no one's going to hold my hand when I request, petabytes of data, but like at least there should be a discussion had about, why or how, or like if there's any possible way in which these sort of requests could be made reasonably. Because data comes in various shapes and sizes, and some of these sizes are not amenable to transferring over the computer, right? Sometimes you have to have just a good talk about them, but an honest talk, right? Like why can't someone? I don't have raw data from the paper that I'm publishing right now. I have data that I've analyzed, and I can send that, and the raw data is stored in UCLA, right? So like there needs to be like a discussion about whenever someone releases data or requests data or requests code. Like first of all, code's got to be well commented. I think these are really good practices to have. But these are things that are disparate. Like I never took a class on how to code. I just understand that if I were to die, someone's got to be able to read my code and be able to hit run and it works, right? And that's not only good coding practice, that's good ethical practice for when you write something, right? So you have to be able to have a conversation if someone wants to access your data. It shouldn't just be like a form that you fill in online and then someone denies your request or says a blurb. Like as difficult as it sounds, we should nearly, I'll put a caveat there, you should nearly always be able to talk about how you got what you got and how you collected what you collected and how you wrote what you wrote. Like there should, as a scientist at least, there should be that willingness to defend your idea or discuss your idea rather than just rely on some sort of impersonal denial or some offhanded remark, I can't do it because of security, or I can't do it because of, size limitations, or I can't, No, you can have a discussion. I think that's the biggest thing. It's like, are you having a discussion? Right? Are you having a dialogue at least? When someone requests something, can you discuss it? When Stanley Perlman didn't look into the data on the Penguin papers, like there should be a discussion about that. Like he should be grilled about that. When Ralph Barrick talks about, or Peter Daszak talks about their work with, Dr. Shu at the PLA lab, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, there should be discussion, right? And that goes beyond just the papers. There should be actually like subpoenas and stuff like that. But like that's another issue. So like the first principle is like open discussion if you can't access something, right? That's like the biggest thing. But it takes time.
Yeah, it takes time and awareness. I think that's the big thing. Even in my own journey, some of the things that we kind of say are obvious today was a point in time where you were unaware of it. Now, one blinder taken out, and an incremental awareness. But other than that, I want to thank you, Wes, for again provoking a really spirited conversation. Of course, Kevin, for bringing all of this together. I think we need a third run at this, or maybe 4 runs. I mean, there's just so many things to unpack. But I guess we just have to save some for the next chat.
Just peel it off like an onion, slice it like a brain.
And cry like when you're peeling onions. We're going to be crying the whole time. Okay, till the next time.
Yeah, once again, it's good to see you, Dom and Kevin, and just invite me. I'll just come on. It's fine.
Thanks a lot, dude. I appreciate your time, Wes. Really do.
Okay, ending it now.